The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 was achieved through the ruthless and well-planned ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Palestinians. And this colonial logic of conquest, destruction, and expulsion has continued to the present day. Today, about a third of the Palestinian people live under a brutal military occupation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. Israel has stolen land, built Jewish-only settlements, expelled Palestinians, and cornered others into ghettos surrounded by walls, military watchtowers, and checkpoints. 12% of the Palestinian people live inside Israel as third-class citizens. They are subjected to a system of racial discrimination and racist laws that amounts to apartheid, as defined by the United Nations. Half of the Palestinian people continue to live outside Palestine as refugees, denied their right to return to their homes. In 2014, Israel carried out one of its bloodiest ever massacres of Palestinians in the besieged Gaza Strip. More than 2,000 people were killed, a quarter of them children. Israel is only able to maintain its regime of oppression because of the support of international governments and corporations. When those in power refuse to act to stop this injustice, we need a global citizens' response to stand alongside Palestinians in their struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. In 2005, Palestinian civil society came together to issue its call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. The appeal calls for concerted nonviolent action to isolate Israel, as was done to apartheid South Africa. We are calling for boycott pressure on Israel until it complies with international law in the following ways: end its occupation and colonization of land seized in 1967, recognize the right of the Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, respect the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. The BDS movement has empowered people across the world to take effective action against Israel. Trade unions, student groups, churches, academics, cultural figures, and social movements are joining together to make an impact. Already, because of BDS, Israeli export companies are complaining that it is getting harder to export their products, and grassroots action has prevented Israeli ships from docking at ports around the world. Major Israeli exporter SodaStream, targeted by our campaign, has announced plans to close a factory it operates in an illegal Israeli settlement. G4S and Veolia, two huge corporations that help Israel maintain its occupation, have lost billions of dollars worth of contracts as a result of BDS activism. Both companies are now talking about ending their role in Israel's crimes. Some European governments are now taking action against aspects of Israel's occupation, and several US academic associations have endorsed a comprehensive academic boycott of Israeli universities. And many prominent musicians and artists support the cultural boycott of Israel, refusing to perform there. Israeli business leaders and politicians are warning that the boycott is starting to isolate Israel. In fact, the government is so worried about the strategic threat that BDS poses to their regime of oppression that it's using its enormous resources to undermine the movement. There's a real fear within Israel that it is fast becoming the pariah state that South Africa once was. But Israel's recent massacre of Palestinians in Gaza is a painful reminder that there's still so much more we need to do. With your support, we can develop even more hard-hitting BDS campaigns and get the word about Palestinian rights out to a wider audience. So please, consider making a donation to the Palestinian BDS National Committee, the largest Palestinian coalition that leads the global movement. It will be a real contribution to the Palestinian struggle for freedom, justice, and equality.
Right. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to another webinar by BDS Malaysia. I'm Khalid, moderator for our webinar today. Recent events in East Jerusalem and Gaza has brought back the world's attention and concern the unresolved issue of Palestine-Israel and the plight of the millions of Palestinians who continue to suffer under Israeli brutal occupation. It has also revived calls from some quarters for the two-state solution, to be pursued as the basis for a peace settlement between Palestine and Israel. The two-state solution, proposed in UN General Assembly and Security Council resolution for the past 40 years, was also the platform of several peace initiatives, all of which have come to nothing. There is now growing disillusionment that the two-state solution can ever again be the basis for just and equitable peace in the region. What exactly is the two-state solution? What is behind the disenchantment with it? Have all parties, through action and words, been receptive or unreceptive of it? Is it still relevant or worthy of consideration given new realities on the ground? Is there an alternative solution? So joining us today to discuss this issue is our panelists from Palestine, from Israel, from Malaysia, and from Japan to discuss this issue, inshallah. First and foremost, I would like to welcome Professor Saul Takahashi. Assalamualaikum, Prof.
Waalaikumsalam. Hello.
For those who first time know Professor Saul is a professor of human rights and peace studies from Osaka Jogakin University. He was also the former deputy head of office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in occupied Palestine from 2009 until 2014. So Prof is a regular on BDS webinar and has also visited Malaysia a couple of times before. Right. So our second panelist is Dr. Professor Madya Dr. Hafizi Omano. Welcome, Doctor.
Assalamualaikum.
So Professor Madya Dr. Hafizi is a chairman of BDS Malaysia. He's also an author of several books on Palestine, including Palestine, Operation Unrivaled. He just published actually a new book called Palestine Kemenangan Yang Dekat oleh terbitan Karangkraft there, published by Karangkraft. So for those who want to...
By the way, I am not the chairman of BDS.
I'm sorry. Chairman of Humanitarian Care Malaysia, My Care.
Have I ousted Professor Nazari Ismail?
Hopefully not. Our third speaker should be Mr. Muslim Imran, the chairman of the Palestinian Cultural Organization Malaysia, and also a PhD candidate on political science at University of Malaya. He still cannot join us live at the moment. He will join us later, inshallah. And another one, it should be Miko Pellet, an Israeli-American peace activist and author of the book The General Sons, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. Unfortunately, he cannot join us live today because he need to go and undergo a COVID-19 test. But he actually recorded a video special for us for this event, and inshallah I will play the video in our program later today, and hopefully we can get some of his opinion about this issue, inshallah. Okay, let's start our programs with our first round of our discussion on the topic of what is actually the two-state solution and what is the opinion by all of our panelists. So it's a general question to all our panelists. What is your opinion on the two-state solution based on your field and on your perspective? Inshallah. Let's start with Professor Saul, inshallah.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And of course, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm glad that you're asking me my opinion, as obviously I'm not Palestinian, so I don't want to pretend like I speak as a representative of the Palestinian people. I do have thoughts on this, of course. I lived there for 5 years, and I still do research on Palestine, and I still do talk with Palestinians very frequently. But at the end of the day, I'm just an outsider, and I do have thoughts on what solutions might be appropriate and what is necessary, certainly from the perspective of international human rights law, which is my specialty. So that's really where I'm coming from. Everybody's heard, over and over about the two-state solution, and every government in the world seems to talk about the two-state solution. The UN talks about the two-state solution, over and over and over. Two states, a Jewish state and a Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security. You've heard this mantra over and over, repeated over and over. And it's been presented as the only viable option for the situation in Palestine over and over. I mean, because, just every time you talk about Palestine, this is what you hear. But people are finally beginning to realize that the two-state solution is completely dead. And the peace process that was supposed to lead to, the establishment of the Palestinian state and this whole thing, the whole two-state solution, all of the so-called peace process that's been going on since Oslo has resulted and basically has become nothing, little more than a smokescreen for Israel to increase its colonial settlement in the West Bank. Remember, the West Bank, of course, includes East Jerusalem, and the Judification of East Jerusalem was one of the direct triggers for the recent escalation in what was going on. The population of colonial settlers in the West Bank is increased fivefold since '93, since the beginning of Oslo. If you go, for a long while, the Israeli government had always been saying, they've been pointing to these colonial settlements in the West Bank. And they were saying, oh, yeah, of course, we'll evacuate these places if we come to a peace agreement with the Palestinians, if there's a partner for peace. And of course, we're ready to do it. Lately, they don't even say that. But that had been an ongoing sort of narrative on the part of the Israeli government throughout the so-called peace process. Now, if you actually go to these places, and more, if you look at like Al Jazeera and more also on the Western media, they're showing what these colonial colonies look like, and then there's no question of these being evacuated. I mean, these are cities. These are not like tent trailer parks. They're cities. They're cities built for permanence. And from the beginning, the Israeli government has always been very, very open that the Judification, Jewish settlement of the West Bank and the entire land of Palestine is what this is all about. Right now, close to 700,000 Israelis live in these colonies. That includes East Jerusalem. So we're looking at, one in about 11, one in about 12 or so Jewish Israelis. So that's how common this is. And, the Israeli government has poured in money, economic incentives for people to move to these colonies, just like all colonial powers have done. They make it they make it an economic good option for people to move to these colonies. So, they have mortgage tax breaks, they have car loan tax breaks. The houses are much cheaper to begin with, and they're more spacious and they're much nicer. It's just, it's the kind of place that you would want to live in if you're a young couple and, starting your new life. The schools are better than the cities because of the subsidies that the Israelis pour into them. So, there are fewer kids per class. The teachers are better, the whole thing. And so these, you have these colonies dotting all throughout the West Bank. And that includes, near the border with Jordan as well. It's not just near the Green Line. And it's also not just the colonies themselves. The Israelis like to argue, oh, but the settlements themselves, they only take up some small percentage of the land. Yeah, it's not just the cities themselves. It's also the quote unquote security zones that surround all of these places. And it's also the roads, the checkpoints, all of these kind of things. The Israelis have really spent a lot of resources building the road network which prioritizes the colonies and the settlers in their travel between the colonies and what is often referred to as Israel proper. And a lot of times, many of these roads, they can't be used by Palestinians, or Palestinians can't cross them. They can't even approach them, all of these kind of things. And they have all these checkpoints, movement restrictions to make sure that Palestinians simply can't move around freely. So basically what I'm saying is you have these colonies dotting throughout the West Bank. And just it's made it impossible for there to be a viable two-state solution. But what's important to understand is that the two-state, this is my opinion, but these are my views, the two-state solution, it's not just a failure because of what Israel has done with the colonial settlements and all that. It is, in practical terms, clearly not going to happen. because of these colonies, because of 700,000 people living there. It's not going to happen. And I think there is broad recognition finally about that. But it's a failure, not just because of that. It's the whole thing is a failed paradigm from the beginning. It's a paradigm that the so-called international community has basically tried to force on the Palestinian people from the beginning of all of this. Really, from the get-go, the international community has utterly failed the Palestinian people, utterly failed to take into account their rights. And that's where the two-state solution comes from. Now, if you look back, 1947, which is when the UN, the relatively newly created United Nations, they adopted the partition resolution. The Brits gave up on Palestine. They did not have the wherewithal or the will to maintain the mandate. So they just said, look, we're not going to deal with this. UN, you sort it out. So they gave it to the UN, and the UN adopted the partition resolution. Now, at that time, Palestinians owned 97% of the land of Palestine. And I can't show you the map right now, but I'm sure many of you, you've seen this map. It is almost completely, owned by Palestinians. So the Zionist settlers only owned like 3 to 4% of the land. That's how little it was. In terms of population, there was an increase, of course, after the Holocaust and World War II, all that. But we're still looking at less than a third of the population of Palestine being Zionist settlers, being Jewish people. So, that's what the situation was. And the UN, they adopt this resolution saying, well, you guys can't get along. So why don't you just split the country in two? Why don't you just give these settlers coming from Europe half of your country? And then it'll be fine. Yeah, it'll work out fine. So, from the get-go, this idea that we're going to just split the country into half and half, and they'll just because they can't get along in the same country, they'll just sort of live separately. From the beginning, this has been a so-called solution that has completely ignored the legitimate Palestinian rights over their country, right? So that's it's really important to remember that the two-state solution from the beginning is a paradigm which ignores Palestinian rights, and it ignores elementary considerations of justice. Now, some people say, yeah, but the Palestinians, they've accepted it. They've accepted the two-state solution paradigm. It's true that the Palestinian Authority, now the government of the state of Palestine, the PA, they have accepted the current two-state framework, which is not even the partition resolution. It is, basically how the map looked like in 48 after the war. So basically, they've accepted this. They've said, we're going to build a country on only 22% of what was originally ours. We'll live with it. So we have the purported representatives of the Palestinian people who have accepted this paradigm. But I think we have to accept ourselves just how representative of the Palestinian people is the PA, right? The PA wasn't something which was elected or created by the Palestinian people. It was parachuted in by the so-called international community again. And in many ways, it has been doing Israel's dirty work for it, right? So through the security coordination with the Israelis, it's the PA now that arrests Palestinians, oftentimes torturing Palestinians, alleged to have been planning terrorist attacks on Israel, right? So, this is really one of the key reasons that the PA has lost legitimacy in the eyes of pretty much all Palestinians that I've ever spoken with, right? So it's important to, when we say that the Palestinians have accepted the two-state paradigm, we have to remember, who exactly accepted this, and who is, who are they really listening to, right? So I think I was going to talk a little bit about the one-state solution, the quote-unquote one-state solution, and where I see that going. But do you want me to stop once here, or do you want me to go on?
Maybe we postpone that. You hold that
Yes,
point
sure.
until we come to the second round, inshallah.
Yes, sure. Okay, right. Of course. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Prof, for your opinions. And it's very important to acknowledge that, as you mentioned, that Palestine has been denied the self-determination to determine the future of the state according to the paradigm of two-state solutions. All right, so next I would like to invite Professor Dr. Hafizi to present his opinion about the two-state solution. Welcome, Prof.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Brother Khalid, and fellow panelists in this forum, Prof. Saul, and also Brother Imran, Muslim Imran. Okay, the two-state solution. This is the issue that we are discussing in this evening. So to start with, where did this idea of a two-state solution came from? I would like to pose this question by looking back into history, well before the formation of the so-called the illegitimate state or the rogue state of Israel. Now, if we go back to as far as the 1920s and 1930s, that was when the British was administering the mandated Palestine as assigned by the League of Nations. So, of course, due to the promise by the British through the Balfour Declaration, the Jews are coming in droves after the formation of the mandated Palestine. And this led to clashes with the local Palestinian people. And eventually it led to some form of armed resistance by Sheikh Izzuddin Qassam, and also political movements to safeguard the rights of the Palestinian people. And there has been some initiative of boycott as well, Arab boycott, so the British have to face this as well. And as a result, the burgeoning Jewish population coming from Europe, so they come up with the Peel Commission. This is after they dealt with the armed resistance. Sheikh Izzuddin Qassam was killed in action in a gunfight, in a fighting at Jenin. That was in 1936. And on that same year, the British came up with a proposal called the Peel Commission. So let's look at the Peel Commission. I think this is the birth or the origin of the so-called two-state solution. They came up with a proposal to allocate the coastal area, which comprised of about 30 to 40% of the original Palestine, to the Jewish immigrant. And most of these Jewish immigrants, they were settling in the hinterlands. These are not fertile lands, the hinterlands. And they want to transfer these Jewish people, these immigrants, from the hinterlands to the coastal areas. And there's about 1,250 Jewish individuals that has been assigned for population swap. And there were about 225,000 Palestinians that were living in coastal areas, in Haifa, in Akka, in Tel Aviv, in Jaffa. So these people would be sent to the hinterlands. And the 1,250 Jewish migrants will replace them, while the 225,000 local Palestinians will be uprooted. So I think this is the origin of the so-called the two-state solution, whereby about 30 to 40% of the coastal areas were assigned to the Jewish immigrant, and the rest remain under the Arab local Palestinian population, like Professor Saul just mentioned just now. The Jewish, they own no more than perhaps 2 or 3% of land in Palestine, and yet the British assigned them almost half, or 30 to 40% of the coastal areas, the fertile coastal areas. But of course, no one is no one welcomed this idea. Yeah? The Arabs reject them, and even the proponents of the Zionists, the Israeli of the future, led by David Ben Gurion at that time, he also rejected this idea because, in the first place, they don't want a portion of the Palestinian land; they want the whole of Palestine. Yeah? So the idea of carving up Palestine into two territories, Jewish and Arab territories, actually came from the British. Now, this idea of the Peel Commission was rejected outright, and they came up with another initiative called the White Paper that was implemented in 1939, and it is supposed to last for about 10 years, whereby in that period, within that period, 75,000 Jewish from Europe will be brought in. Yeah? And they gave this vague promise of Palestine will have an independent state. So they did not mention about carving up the land or partitioning them into Jewish and Arab territory. So the British promised that Palestine will be in an independent state, but Jewish migrants will be continued to be brought in. Yeah? And by 1944, that is in the midst of Second World War, but it's toward the end, yeah? Only about 50,000 of the 75,000 that has been targeted by the British to bring in the Jews were managed to be transferred or brought into Palestine. So it failed to reach the target. So they try to pick up and plan to transfer about 1,500 Jews from Europe every month. And this was also rejected by certain Arab, especially the Arab Higher Committee, with the Grand Mufti, Benjamin Husseini, at the helm. He also objected to this proposal. Even the Jews were also rejecting this idea because, like I have maintained just now, they want the whole of Palestine, not just any portion carved up piece or part of Palestine. So, what happened? The migration or the migration of Jews into Palestine did not stop. After the end of the Second World War, we know Holocaust was an excuse for the Jews to come in. Hundreds and thousands were actually facilitated by the British and the Americans to enter into Palestine. Yeah? So, as a result of this, the newly formed United Nations, they come up with this partition plan, and it was passed at the United Nations General Assembly in 1947, 29th of November, to the date, whereby 55% of the land is allocated to the Jewish migrants, and 45% remain under the local Palestinian Arabs. And of course, this is rejected by the Palestinians and also rejected by the Arabs at that time, and it led to the first Arab-Jewish war that ended in 15th of May 1948, when Israel was officially declared and got the recognition from the United States barely 10 minutes after it was announced. President Harry S. Truman picked up the phone and congratulated David Ben Gurion. And the funny part is, the outcome of this war, Israel earned more land. Instead of the 55% allocated by the United Nations, they gained an additional 23% of Palestine, and in all, 78% of Palestine came under the Israeli administration. Only 22% was left to the local indigenous people, which is practically West Bank, East Jerusalem, and also the Gaza Strip. This is the situation in 1948. And in 1949, there was an agreement which is called the Rhodes Armistice in 1949, whereby this additional land was approved under the Rhodes Armistice. So that was the basis for the Israel of 1948, which comprised of 78% of the land, the Palestinian land, and the boundaries that separate Israel and former Palestine, which came under the Jordanian administration, West Bank and East Jerusalem, that is called the Green Line. And you know what happened in 1967? Israel launched an all-out offensive against the Arab countries, especially Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and they control or they occupy the whole of Palestine. Not a single inch of land is left, including East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, and additionally Sinai and the Golan Heights in Syria. So this is not recognized by the United Nations, and it's called the occupied territories. And they passed Resolution 242 for Israel to withdraw back to the Green Line. And this is the basis of the so-called two-state solution, the idea of which did not even come from the Zionists, nor is being entertained by the Arabs, but it is something that is being forced onto the Palestinians through Resolution 181, and then the Rhodes Armistice of 1949, and then again by the passing of the Resolution 242 in 1967. So the idea was for Israel to return back to the Green Line, and therefore the so-called two sovereign state, Palestine and Israel, lie next to one another, becoming neighboring sovereign states. So that is the so-called the two-state that has become a mantra, like Professor Saul mentioned just now, over and over again until today, although it has lost any sense of implementation. It will never be realized. Yeah? If we look at Israel today, they are not interested. Yeah? They are not interested in 78%, whatever they have achieved up until 1949. They want the whole of Palestine. This is the saying that there is no Jerusalem without Judea and Samaria, which is the West Bank. They refer them as the old kingdoms of Israel, which is Judea and Samaria. And then there is no Jerusalem without the temple. So the West Bank, including the Jordan Valley, which Netanyahu announced last year to be annexed by Israel. That is the integral part of Israel. It will never be given up. East Jerusalem or Jerusalem will not be given up. Will not be given up, and we will remain as the eternal capital of Israel. This has been declared way back in 1967. So the two-state solution did not come from the proponents of Zionism, did not come from the Israeli side. It was forced onto the Palestinians and even on the Israelis who rejected them outright. They aim for the whole of Palestine. So what is the relevance of the two-state solution that we are discussing? It will never be realized, never. Ever. It will never be realized because it is not the objective of the Israeli to start with from day one. And even if Hamas in Gaza at one time agrees, if Israel withdraws to the Green Line, they agree to a long-term ceasefire, Hodena, which should be renewed as and when it is needed, like every 5 years or so. But the question of recognizing Israel does not exist. Is out of the question, because to the Palestinians there are three constants. They call it the three national constant. It is non-negotiable. Number one, the right of return of the Palestinian refugees hosted by the neighboring countries. And number two, Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine. And number three, none of the peace agreements would be recognized because these are not agreements. These are not peace accord or whatever you want to call it. These are a series of lies to gain more land, to misappropriate land, to evict people from their homes, to demolish homes, to take more lands from the Palestinians in the West Bank. So this is a situation. In fact, in 1993, when the Oslo Accord was signed, there was a timetable. 5 years after 1993, that is 1998, the state, the so-called sovereign state of Palestine, will come to reality. Of course, this is the biggest lie, because Israel did not stop the process of Judaization, bringing in more Jews in the environs of Jerusalem or Baitul Maqdis, and they built more settlements, like mentioned by Professor Saul just now. The number of settlements actually increased 5 times from 1993 to 1998. So it remains vague. The question of a two-state solution remains vague and meaningless. Therefore, we should not resort to or continue to debate or even to expound on this idea of the two-state solution. We should, in fact, or instead, focus on the status of Israel as an apartheid state, which discriminates its own Arab population, which continue to defy United Nations Resolution 1943 in parentheses, whereby the refugees were actually being given the permission to return to their homes in the soonest during that time in 1949. But they remained there for 73 years. Now they are in the third generation. The first generation has already passed on. So they remain as refugees for seven decades. So this, as far as this is not complied to, the right of return and Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine, and the question of recognizing Israel does not arise at all. Israel should not be recognized for whatever reason, because they came in and they stole the Palestinians from their own country. So that is my view on how we should look at the two-state solution. It is pointless to bring it up again, and it will never become a reality, and we should move on and deal with Israel as an apartheid state and forget about two-state solution. It is dead and buried, as I see it. Wallahu alam. Thank you, Brother Khalid Jimat. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hafizi, for a lengthy explanation about the background of two-state solution, how it comes from British occupation back in 1930s, and whereby they failed to settle the problem, and then now they passed to the United Nations, and now we are struggling with the aftermath of their planning to partition the land. All right, let's now hear from the Palestinian itself about these issues, about two-state solution. Let's hear from Brother Muslim on his opinion as a Palestinian about this so-called solution.
Okay, thank you very much, my dear brother Khalid, Prof. Sol, Prof. Hafizi, and our dear friends watching this discussion. I think one of the most challenging things is to come up with an acceptable solution that everyone will agree on. That's in all conflicts and in all problems. There will always be a disagreement. There will always be complaints. Even in a court of justice, when the judge makes his or her ruling, there will always be dissatisfied quarters. But the more important concern is, has justice been served? I mean, if you bring a criminal, a thief, to a court, and the person who got robbed, and the judge makes any ruling, of course, if it punishes the thief will be unhappy. That's a natural human response. So when talking about a solution, a lasting solution, one important thing that we're missing is justice. Yes, it has to be a workable solution, a solution that will last. I mean, lasting solution. It should be a lasting solution, but it should not ignore the root cause of the problem. It should address the problem. What I feel from discussions about two-state solution, mainly in the West, is that they keep on repeating it like a ritual, like a mantra, because it feels good. I mean, of course, even in our academic inquiries, and our good guests here are academicians, it always feels good to have a theory or an explanation for something, even if that explanation is wrong. But it feels good to have an answer. We're humans, we want answers. We don't want to always be faced by puzzles and questions. So those who have come up with the two-state solution as early as 1947, I think, felt very proud. Probably they congratulated themselves at the end of the session, and they felt that, okay, we've solved the problem. But they ignored the reality. They ignored the situation on the ground. They ignored that justice was not served. In fact, they helped pave the way for Nakba through their way of thinking. So again, just as a start and as an introduction, the two-state solution is a beautiful fantasy that decision makers across the globe have been fantasizing about and talking about. It makes them all feel good, but it doesn't solve the problem. It misses the most important the root cause. It's colonialism. It's settler colonial occupation. It's Nakba. I mean, to be more specific, Nakba is the most important root cause of what is happening right now, 73 years later. You can't address the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and come up with solutions if you try to sweep Nakba under the carpet. Because looking at the two-state solution, whether the 1947 two-state solution or the Oslo two-state solution or the revived two-state solution that the American administration is talking about now, it continues to ignore the plight of 7 million Palestinian refugees, half our population. If we always find solutions for conflicts because of humans, I mean, the solution should serve the human, not the dead things, not the properties. Even in Islamic, belief, a drop of blood from any Muslim is more important than Kaaba itself, than the most sacred place in Islam, and in the Quran as well. وَمَنْ أَحْيَاهَا فَكَأَنَّمَا أَحْيَا النَّاسَ جَمِيعًا. Whoever saves a life or gives life or protects life is as if he or she has saved the whole mankind. So it makes no sense to me when we try to solve a problem by ignoring more than 70% of the Palestinian people. Half of our people are refugees, 7 million, and 2 million Palestinians continue to be under Israeli apartheid inside Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel. These people, for 73 years, they have been trying to get used to the situation, get accustomed to it. But 73 years later, they couldn't. They revolted in the last 2 weeks, and we've seen pictures from Lid, Haifa, Yafa, and even in Tel Aviv itself, how the Jewish supremacist community started to harass these Palestinians, attack their shops, and mobs started to lynch them and so on, and how this was a state-sponsored policy, and these Palestinians could not take it. So again, to address the two-state solution. It's a good fantasy. It sounds good. It looks good. It feels good. But to those who are not facing the injustice, to those who are not under occupation, but for those who are refugees for 73 years, no, it doesn't solve the problem. For those who are refugees, or for those who are under direct Israeli apartheid inside Israel, it doesn't address their problem. They are continuously, subject to systematic apartheid. This is if it is implemented in full. But looking at what happened after the two-state solution started to pick up, ground and support, we see that even those who were supposed to be saved by this solution, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, have become subject to a terrible, brutal apartheid in the West Bank and sanctions and siege in the Gaza Strip. So, the pre-two-state solution setting was way better than the current setting. So looking at the root cause, again, it is Nakba, and it is the negation of the Palestinians. They continuously negate our existence. We don't exist to them. I mean, for those who are trying to solve the problem by simply cutting off the map, this is the same imperialist mindset that destroyed Africa and the Middle East in the past. This is the same mindset that was used in the Berlin Conference to craft a new African, continent. This is the same mindset of Sykes-Picot, this supremacist colonial mindset that, give this part to Egypt and this part to Libya, this part to Sudan and this part to Egypt, and you draw straight lines. And this resulted in continuous wars and military coups and tribal conflicts that we continue to see until today in Africa and in the Middle East. So no, two-state solution is not a solution. It's some sort of philosophical, not even philosophy. It's a sophistry. The sophists who existed long ago in Greece, they enjoyed debates and discussions. So it's more of sophistry than a practical, real solution. Any solution has to acknowledge Nakba and has to recognize the Palestinians. The problem is not recognition of Israel, actually. Israel is a nuclear power. The problem is recognition of the existence of the Palestinians. The Zionist movement, which started in Europe some 1.5 centuries ago, assumed that there were no Palestinians in Palestine. They, repeated continuously the claim that Palestine is a land with no people for a people with no land. And they bought this lie. I mean, they created the lie. They bought the lie. They continue to repeat it until today. But when they come to Palestine, they found people. We were there. And they could not get rid of us like our Red Indian brothers and sisters, or our Aborigine brothers and sisters in Australia. The Palestinians survived, thankfully. We thank God for that. They killed some of us, they forced some of us out, but half of our population remained under their occupation. So when any Israeli historian tries to look at the situation, it really poses very challenging questions to him or her. That Zionism was based on a lie, a very big myth, and it failed. To cut it short, I don't want to delve into historical background, but let's highlight how the current two-state solution came about. Just now, my fellow panelists highlighted how we reached this stage, but let me just look into recent history. The Palestinians accepted, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization leadership accepted the two-state solution because of realistic calculations. The Soviet Union collapsed, so the Palestinian revolutionary current had to find a way out. The Palestinians were forced out of Lebanon, a neighboring country. The leadership of the PLO found itself locked up in small offices in Tunis, very far from Palestine. The Soviet Union, which supported the Palestinian struggle, disappeared. The Arabs got busy fighting each other in the invasion of Kuwait and later in the Gulf War. The Palestinians were strangled financially by the US and its allies. So eventually, the PLO leadership found itself alone. Unlike the 60s and the 70s, when there were Arab nationalist regimes which wanted to actually end Israeli occupation. In the early 90s, Yasser Arafat found himself alone, literally alone, not only because of the regional and international setup, but also because of the Palestinian setup. Israel conducted targeted assassination, killed Abu Iyad, Abu Jihad, very senior Palestinian resistance leaders. And Arafat literally found himself alone. They started to do some realistic calculations, and they found out that let's establish a state in the West Bank and Gaza according to international law, which has not been very fair to us, and we build on that. So I don't buy that Arafat or the mainstream Fatah movement has accepted the two-state solution because they want to end up with the West Bank and Gaza only. I mean, look at the logo of Fatah and the PLO. The historical map of Palestine is still there. They changed their charter, at least the PLO charter, but in reality, you ask any Fatah member, they don't really want to end up with a small toothless state in the West Bank and Gaza. They want to eventually get back the rest of Palestine, but their political leadership decided, because of realistic calculations, to accept what was given. But what has happened after that is that Israel took advantage of the Palestinian weakness and expanded its settler colonial occupation. Look at the situation in the West Bank. Saul visited you lived in the West Bank. You've seen how within 28 years, or let's say 30 years, since Oslo, since Madrid Accord, there was no real settler existence inside the West Bank. Now we have more than 500,000 Israeli settlers all over the West Bank. We have many settlers spreading all over Jerusalem, and these people are radicals. The settlers who, I mean, Zionism is a radical ideology, but those new settlers who come from Brooklyn, from the US, from all corners of the world to Hebron or Jerusalem. I've seen them in Hebron when I was growing up. These are fanatics. The ones who are trying to force out the people in Sheikh Jarrah, these are the worst of fanatics. In Israeli political landscape, when you look at settler political parties, these are usually the most fanatic of all. Now they are in government. And these people don't want a Palestinian state. They don't. I mean, they don't hide it. They say it publicly. You ask them, you interview them. They don't believe the Palestinians deserve anything, because they still buy the same lie that their forefathers created a century ago, that Palestinians shouldn't have existed here. What are you doing here? I mean, the logic they have is that we've come to our ancestral homeland. What are the Palestinians doing here? Okay, the Palestinians were here for a while to take care of the land. It's time to move. Go to Jordan, go to Gaza, go to wherever. So to cut it short, this solution is not a solution. The Palestinian Liberation Organization was putting forward one democratic state solution until the late 80s. It is unfortunate that they abandoned this because of short-sighted political calculations. A solution should address Nakba, should address the 7 million Palestinian refugees, should address the Palestinians inside Israel, and should, of course, think about the considerations of the other side, but not at the expense of the Palestinians. We will never accept, I mean, no sane Palestinians will ever accept to solve the problem of the European Jewish community at the expense of our own existence. We had no problem with them if they came in peace and lived with us peacefully, like many immigrant communities have come to Southeast Asia or to Europe or to America. But these people did not come in peace. These people came with weapons. By the year 1947, the end of 1947, there were more than 120,000 Zionist militias up in arms to take over Palestine. The Palestinian political leadership was in exile. Mufti Amin al-Husseini and his High Arab Commission were in exile, and the Palestinian resistance was very, toothless. So Israelis conducted an ethnic cleansing. They took over Palestine. 6 months later, the Arab armies came over and they did not mount any serious challenge to Israel. Less than 1/3 of the Israeli or Zionist militias. So the solution is, to conclude my comment, is more patience, more persistence, we have to learn from our South African brothers. Mandela spent 27 years in apartheid prisons, and he was sticking to his slogan, one man, one vote. He did not compromise on this very basic right, the right of equality. You know, the PLO failed to stick to our plight and principles, and that's why it was abandoned by many. In fact, after the Oslo Accord, more than 10 factions, most of them PLO members, rejected the Oslo Accord. Popular Front, Democratic Front, you name it. Many of socialist factions, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, who were growing by that time, also rejected the Oslo Accord. And as we speak, most Palestinians continue to feel that the Oslo Accord was a big lie that costed the Palestinians more land and more rights. And this is a historical mistake that has to be corrected. The only one who really sticks to the Oslo Accord is President Mahmoud Abbas, and I mean, you know how popular he is in the Palestinian political landscape. So finally, a solution is the solution starts with the acknowledgement of Nakba, acknowledgement of the injustice that took place in Nakba. This is what Ilan Pappé, for instance, the new Israeli historian, concludes in his good book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. He says the first measure that should be taken by Israel and the international community to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is acknowledgement of Nakba. You cannot just, pretend that Nakba did not happen. The second thing is abandonment of Zionism. Zionism is a defunct extremist ideology. This supremacist, violent ideology was a natural response to European fascist ideologies of the late 19th century. The fascist Nazist ideologies of Europe, which persecuted the Jews, and that was a fact, resulted in an ultra-nationalist response, Zionism, which continued to evolve and was at first started by secular left-wing Zionist leaders, but later got I won't say hijacked, it got it transformed into an extremist right-wing nationalist and religious ideology based on the ideology of Jabotinsky and the current subscribers to this ideology, Netanyahu and his gang. This ideology cannot. I mean, this is the 21st century. Seriously, it's a shock that people subscribe to this supremacist extremist ideology, which negates the existence of others. So the Zionist society, the Israeli society, has to abandon Zionism as a start, just like the South African apartheid society abandons apartheid. Finally, okay, I said finally many times, but this is really finally. Finally, we want an independent Palestinian state, but not an artificial, unviable small cantonment similar to what the apartheid regime created in the past, the Bantustans. We don't want Bantustans in Ramallah, in Hebron, and another in Gaza. We want a real Palestinian state, a viable Palestinian state. And to me, in my own perspective, it has to be the whole of Palestine. We don't have a problem with the individual Jewish, citizens or the Jewish faith in the first place. We don't have a problem with them. They lived in Palestine for centuries. We were very hospitable to them. There is a Jewish Palestinian community until today in Nablus. Palestinian Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisted. Even Baha'is coexisted with us in Palestine. But a Zionist violent ideology that took over Palestine is a cancer. It's a problem. It has to be abandoned. Nakba has to be addressed. Then there is a way out. That's why I think it's a waste of time when OIC member states or the international community talks about giving life back to the two-state solution. I mean, it's a zombie now. It's dead. What kind of life are you giving it back? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Muslim, for, I think you not only mentioned about whether the two-state solution is relevant or not, but also you shared about the possible solution to the conflict that we discussed now. So next we're going to play, a video, a recorded video by Miko Pellet, who cannot join us live today because he has to undertake a COVID-19 test for those who don't know or haven't heard about Miko, Miko is an Israeli-American peace activist and the author of the book of the General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. He was born in Jerusalem into a staunchly Zionist family, but his father, General Pallet, although a nationally prominent war hero, is a strong advocate for Israel complete withdrawal from the Palestinian occupied territories 1967. So Miko actually continue the legacy of his father to fight for peace in Palestine. So I'm gonna play a pre-recorded video from him, inshallah, about his views on two-state solution.
I think I can't hear the sound. I don't know if the audience can.
And COVID is still a problem, and I have a COVID exam that I need to take at this time. So the coordinating, the timing didn't work out. But I hope I can get my point across in this short video. We are exactly 54 years after the Israeli army, in which my father was a senior member, a general, a member of the Central Command, was pushing to start a war, to start what became a massive assault against Israel's Arab neighbors. The assault begins, a few days from now, on June the 5th, and within 6 days, the Israeli army had captured the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula, again, in what was a massively brutal assault against Arab neighbors. Now, immediately when the war was over, in the very first meeting of the Israeli High Command, my father suggested what we know today to be the two-state solution. He suggested that Israel allow the Palestinians to establish their own state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and engage in a peace agreement with them, and that will really solve all the problems in the Middle East, because once Israelis and Palestinians have resolved the question of Palestine, the other Arab countries will probably follow suit. He insisted on this, and he for quite some time while still in uniform. And eventually he was taken aside by his boss, which was Haq Rabin, who was the Army Chief of Staff, and gently told that this is not the time to talk about this. We had just conquered all of the land of Israel, plus some, and nobody wants to hear about giving land back to Arabs. Israel went immediately, and I mean immediately, while the barrels were still smoking, to destroy Palestinian towns, neighborhoods, villages throughout the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in the surrounding areas surrounding Jerusalem, within the old city, the Mughrabi quarter, which now is the plaza facing the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, and a massive assault against Palestinians. Hundreds of thousands were expelled, became refugees, many for the second time. And what they saw, what the Israeli authorities, the military and the government saw, was that they had finished the job that they failed to finish in 1948. In other words, the total conquest of what they call the land of Israel, which they, as Zionists, view to belong to the Jewish people. In other words, the entire land of Israel belongs, according to Zionism, to the entire Jewish people, which is, of course, absurd. But that's what they saw. And as we've seen over the last 54 years, the West Bank has been subjected to massive ethnic cleansing and destruction, an oppressive military regime. And basically, the state of Israel, through consecutive governments, has done everything it possibly could to destroy any chance of a Palestinian state ever being established in those areas, in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, or actually anywhere within Palestine. And they established what they believed they had the right to do, a single state over all of historic Palestine. Today, as a result of a report by Human Rights Watch, as a result of several other organizations, and of course people who have eyes and ears can see this entire state, which is the state of Israel, is an apartheid regime. It's been an apartheid regime since it was established, since its very inception in 1948. It was established as an apartheid regime. It has been engaged in what I believe is not only the crime of apartheid, which is well established, but also the crime of ethnic cleansing and the crime of genocide. Now, these are well-defined crimes in international law, which is why I use those terms. And this is a reality that exists today. There is a single state over all of Palestine. There are Israeli Jews and Palestinians living completely segregated, but very close to each other geographically, because it's a small country. So that is the reality we face today. Those of us who believe in justice, those of us who believe that Palestinians have rights, those who believe that Palestinians deserve the exact same rights that I have when I'm here, those of us who believe that there should not be a siege on Gaza, that it's wrong to put 2 million people in a prison and then bomb them, those of us who believe that there should not be political prisoners, there should not be checkpoints, that people should live free and equal, those of us who believe in equality. The challenge that we have, I believe, is not to try to go back to an idea which was a Zionist idea to begin with. In other words, the people like my father who proposed this idea of a two-state solution were Zionists. Their perspective was a Zionist perspective, which said that Israel has a right to almost 80% of Palestine, and Palestinians have a right to a small, insignificant part of the land just to keep them quiet. So it makes no sense to go back to that. Makes no sense to fall back on an idea which is basically a Zionist idea, and which has, throughout the 90s, or for I should say, 20 years now, has been an excuse for Israel to continue to bomb and kill and arrest and oppress Palestinians. Because Israel figured out that it could use this idea of a two-state solution as an excuse. Well, our hands are out, reaching out for peace. We would be happy to agree on the two-state solution, but the Palestinians are terrorists. The Palestinians disagree, which is, of course, a complete lie, but it's a lie that's been accepted. So I don't think it makes any sense to talk about that, because it's a solution that is not a solution. It's based on, like I said, a Zionist paradigm, a Zionist construct that needs to be completely, I believe, swept off the table for good. The only solution, I believe, that is realistic, that has a chance of solving and resolving the major issues that plague Palestine, is a single democracy with complete equal rights from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. In other words, on all of historic Palestine. This is where we need to be going. I believe that the reason to demand that our governments throughout the world not only accept and support the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS, but that they demand, that they impose sanctions, that they demand boycotts, that our governments act fiercely so that the state of Israel, the Zionist regime, this apartheid, cruel apartheid regime that exists here now, and I have to say, being here, it's not that I didn't know, it's not that I haven't seen this before, but every time I walk down the streets in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, every time I travel throughout the country to meet Palestinian friends and colleagues, the notion of apartheid becomes more and more clear. It's a reminder of how severe and how horrible this apartheid regime really is. So that needs to be, that's what needs to go. There has to be a total isolation, a total boycott, sanctions, divestment from the state of Israel until the Zionist regime collapses. Just like the apartheid regime collapsed in South Africa. It wasn't because white South Africans decided one day that it was wrong of them to engage in apartheid. It was because they were brought to their knees. People with a South African passport couldn't travel anywhere. Sports teams, not participate in sporting events. You know, even sporting organizations were not allowed to invite South Africans because they would be kind of penalized for doing that. Not to mention artists, musicians, academics, and so on, and politicians and diplomats. This has to be made very, very clear. Now, it's the vision of a single democracy with equal rights, where the right of return becomes a reality, is the way forward, I believe. That's what we should be focusing on. That's what we should be working on. There is no difference between the West Bank, for example, which really no longer exists. And if we talk about the West Bank for a moment, it's just somebody took a piece of paper and a map and a pencil and drew it, because that's what Israel wanted back in 1948. Those are the boundaries that Israel chose. The same goes for the Gaza Strip. Somebody took a pen or a pencil and drew it and said, okay, this is going to be a place where we push in hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees that were just kicked out of the southern part of Lebanon. The southern part of Palestine. So these were areas that were, created by Israel anyway. And today, really, there is no West Bank. There's a region in which there are these ghettos of large Palestinian population, enclosed by checkpoints, enclosed by Israeli settlements. And sometimes, as I'm sure many of you know, the settlements where the water is flowing and the electricity is always running and the roads are paved and everybody can travel and has complete democratic rights, are across the street from Palestinian towns and villages where there is no access to water, no access to electricity, or limited access to water and electricity. The roads are not paved, and of course people have no rights across the street, quite literally. So that is the reality that we need to come back, and we need to revert. We need to change that. We need to create a real democracy with equal rights. Now, if we do our job, if we work hard, if we are able to, or when we are able to do this, to bring the Zionist regime to its knees, to demand that all political prisoners be released, to demand that all the political parties, Palestinian political parties, are allowed to participate, and there are real elections, one person, one vote, throughout all of historic Palestine, with real representation, then we can eventually have a legislature that represents all the people, and a government that represents all the people. And then we can start solving all the big problems. The state of Israel, as long as the state of Israel exists, there will never be an end to the siege in Gaza. Political prisoners will never be released. The ghettos in what used to be the West Bank will never stop. Palestinians in all areas of Palestine, whatever status they may have under Israeli law, will always be oppressed and denied the basic most rights of things like water and electricity and education and healthcare, not to mention political rights, not to mention the oppression, not to mention being tortured by the Israeli secret police. If we want to prevent, or if we want to stop all that, then we have to completely reverse or change the reality here, which means bringing down the Zionist regime. Now, once that is done, and once this legislature and this government exists, then there will have to be a constitution written. Then there will have to be they will have to figure out a way to allow a mechanism that will allow the refugees to return and be paid reparations, and for places like Gaza to be rebuilt. And so all of this can only be done. All of this can only be done the day after Zionism falls, the day after Palestine is free, liberated, and democratic. And so I strongly believe that, again, the entire conversation of a two-state solution should be put behind us, and we should focus on how we move forward, how we make sure the state of Israel collapses, that the Zionist regime collapses, and we bring about a real democratic regime, a real democratic and liberated and free Palestine. And regardless what country we live in, we need to make sure trade with Israel should be banned. Not only relations, but trade. And I remember being asked by people in Malaysia, what about our jobs? We work for Israeli companies. Israeli companies have factories and so forth in Malaysia. It's a tough call, but it has to be done. This is the only way. Just to talk about solidarity is not enough. We have to demand action. We have to be part of the resistance. I don't think solidarity is enough. We have to be part of the resistance. And the way we do that is by demanding that our governments, business people, people around us in society in general, understand why they must boycott, why they must divest, why we must oppose sanctions and isolate the state of Israel, and the wonderful future that this place has or could have if when Palestine is liberated. And I'll just say one last thing, which is that being here over the last few weeks, it's beyond belief just how severe the situation is, how tense the situation is, how close we are to seeing Al-Aqsa being destroyed, the entire old city of Jerusalem being destroyed, other monuments throughout the entire country, Palestinian society, Palestinian communities being destroyed, the viciousness and the brutality of the state of Israel, of the Zionist regime, and all of its different groups, whether it's in the defense or whether it's just Palestinians walking down the street or being lynched. These are things that are so severe and are more severe than they've been before. So Israel is marching ahead, very, very determined to destroy Palestine and its people. We must be doubly determined, 10 times more determined, to win that battle and to free Palestine. So once again, thank you very much. Again, I'm sorry I can't be with you in person and answer questions, but hopefully we will be able to actually meet in person before too long. I already have a few engagements that are in person, so I guess conferences are coming back, and I hope to see all of you very, very soon. Thank you so much, and free Palestine.
Right, that's from Miko in his messages. Hopefully, we can get a clear about his opinion about these issues, the two-state solution, and he also mentioned about the solution, the real solution, to change things on the ground, and he focuses really on the fights to bring down the Zionist regime, as mentioned by Muslim before. So I'd like to bring back Professor Saul on your opinion about the solution as we mentioned by Miko and Muslim just now.
Right. Okay. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Yes. No. Thank you. I mean, I think a lot of what I wanted to say or what I was hoping to say has already been said by Muslim, of course, and by Miko. Really, the whole idea of a two-state solution, as I've mentioned before, it was a failed paradigm from the start that was imposed on the Palestinian people with shocking disregard for their rights by the so-called international community, and really. I think what we all have to start thinking about really is how to move forward towards a so-called one-state solution, often called a one democratic state, as is referred to by many people. And it's I think the really important thing that I want to say, I just have two main things that I want to say as a human rights lawyer and somebody who's worked in who used to work in the UN for a long time. The first thing is that when we're talking about a one-state solution, the absolute vital, it's elementary that the legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people have to be in the driver's seat. They have to be in a leading role in defining the parameters of this and what exactly this is going to look like. And I say that because, finally now all of a sudden, like the dams have broken and all of a sudden we're being flooded with talk of the one-state solution. It's very interesting because when I was in Palestine working for the United Nations, it was still the case that within Israeli society talk of a one-state solution, or more accurately speaking, from their viewpoint, annexing the West Bank. This was still a taboo. I mean, when I was first arrived, it was still a taboo. People didn't want to talk about it. People were afraid of opening these floodgates because many people knew that they would be faced with the decision. Are we going, okay, we annex the West Bank. What happens then? Are we going to remain a Zionist state, a Jewish supremacist state, and say, oh yeah, we've got millions of Palestinians now, but too bad for them. They don't have any rights. They're not citizens. They're nobodies, and we're gonna make life so miserable for them that they're going to want to leave, which is what we've been doing up till now. Or are we going to, become a truly democratic state where, like the other speakers have been talking about, Palestinians can also vote. They have civil rights, and they have not just, the right to vote. That's what I'm going to get to, but also, there is meaningful protection for their human rights throughout. And, for Zionists and generally for Israelis, this is like an existential dilemma. They've been socialized into believing that this is their land, nobody else's, and this is a Jewish supremacist state. Life is great for us, and it's just hunky dory. Why do we have to change anything? But they also have this self-image of being a Western democracy, if you believe it. They honestly believe that they're like this human rights respecting, wonderful country. I don't understand the psychology behind this, but it's it's hard to look at yourself in the mirror. So it's, they have this dilemma. They just didn't want to talk about it. But when I was there, I saw it. It was really very interesting. All of a sudden, one day, the floodgates just opened. And you saw, of course, I don't read Hebrew, but you saw certainly in the English language Israeli press, just editorial after editorial and commentary after commentary about what should we do? Should we just go ahead and do it and annex the West Bank? Or no, we have to be democratic. There are all these debates. And it was very interesting that all of a sudden just things had changed. I think, there were probably some kind of, hidden intentions behind it, but it was also the whole criticism leveled at them by Goldstone. And there was a little bit more of an effort to sort of think of what we are as a country. Now, of course, maybe that was just short-lived. But my point is when we talk about one state, a lot of Israelis, the one state that they envision is Israel. And, we just gobble up the Palestinians, and maybe we, give them the right to vote like the 48 Palestinians do. Hey, that's enough, right? Or maybe we just, we try to population transfer them, or we just do like we've been doing in the West Bank, all these kind of ideas. But what they envision when they're talking about a one state is, I can assure you, completely different from what you and I are talking about and what elementary considerations of justice will require. So it's really important, and this is something which cannot be stressed enough in these kind of policy debates and international policy debates, international fora, the UN, that there have to be legitimate representatives of the Palestinians that are really driving this process. Not Abbas, not the PA, but really legitimate representation here, and that's really extremely important. And the other thing I want to say is Muslim was saying this is the importance of justice, and voting is fine. Everybody has to have the right to vote. That's extremely important, but that's not enough. Right? Look at, people, I've seen articles written by sort of starry-eyed, well-meaning activists like in the United States talking about, oh yeah, no, we just make it one state. And then it's like it becomes a civil rights struggle, a struggle for civil rights like the Black people in America. Well, look at where we are now in the United States. I don't know if that's really such a great model, right? They can all vote, but they are in a system where economically, socially, and politically, they are completely disenfranchised and marginalized. And that's one of the lessons that we see actually from South Africa. So the South African, the example in South Africa has been mentioned, I think, by some of the other speakers as well. But it is actually one of the lessons, because the boycott, international boycott movement forced the white regime of South Africa to abandon apartheid. That was good. That was very positive, of course. But the deal was made that economic power would remain in the hands of the white settlers. So this is, where are we now? I mean, yes, black people can vote, but it's still a situation where, the white people have all the power. And in fact, in some ways, it's even got worse. So we have to make sure that these kind of things don't happen. We have to make sure that, justice is ensured. And just like one example, one example that really quickly comes to mind is that of the colonies, right? So, okay, from today, where everybody's citizen of one country, call it whatever we want, but is citizen of one country. Okay, you have these cities all throughout the West Bank that are built on stolen Palestinian land. So, okay, well, what happens there? What happens to the Palestinians who had their land stolen? Maybe we could come up with an agreement where maybe, now it's only Jewish people who can live in the colonies, but maybe Palestinians could live there too. Okay. But then how are they going to pay the rent? I mean, where are they going to have the financial means to do this? And what if they say they don't want it? What if they say they don't like this city? It's ugly and terrible. I want my land back. These are not insurmountable. None of this is insurmountable. But it takes political will, and to have that kind of political will, like the other speakers have been saying, we have to push this as the citizens. We have to demand this from our governments and from the international community, that that Israel is completely isolated, is completely boycotted and sanctioned until we, that is the Palestinian people, see justice. That really is the only way forward, I think. So, thank you.
Right. Thank you, Prof. Saul. Next to Dr. Hafizi, if you want to add on your comment on the solutions that's been proposed by our panelists before.
Okay. Thank you, Brother Khalid. The explanation given by Miko Pellet is really enlightening. And we hope to have more people of conscience from among the Israelis themselves, like the likes of Miko Pellet and also Ilan Pape, and these are actual manifestation of changes that we are seeing among the later generations of Israelis who are now supporting the Palestinian cause. The problem with the Zionists has been expounded by the columnists of Haaris, the daily, the Israeli daily, the mouthpiece of the Israel, whereby he revealed that these are the attitudes and the problem of Israelis. Number one, he said that they were just like drug addicts. This is mentioned by an Israeli himself. He was addressing the Israeli lobby in the States, actually criticizing Gideon Levy, yes, criticizing the Israeli lobby in the United States, and he said that Americans keep on giving funds so that they can buy more drugs, and in the end they become junkies, hardcore junkies. This is what's happening to the Israeli now. So what the Americans should be doing is to set up a rehabilitation center, stop the funding, and start a rehabilitation program to transform the Israelis so that they came out of their addiction. This is an idea actually came from Gideon Levy. And then number two, he also mentioned that the Israelis, the Zionists, they are the only occupier in the whole history of mankind who consider themselves as a victim. They are the colonizer, they occupy Palestinian land, and yet they identify themselves as victims, and they portray themselves as victims, and thus such narrative came from the mouthpiece of the Zionists. We have the right to self-defense. A colonial power is portraying himself as a victim and the only victim. So this is a second attitude of the Zionists. And number three, they dehumanize others, especially the Palestinians. That's why we are seeing that the Zionists and the Israelis, they don't have any qualms at random killings of Palestinians on the street. School children, teachers on their way to school, they kill them in these so-called random killings and create stories that they are actually a threat to the Zionist soldiers. So they dehumanize them. So that's why we are seeing incidents of random killings from time to time. It's not just during the massive attack that previously took place, or in 2014 or 2012. Actually, such assassinations and killings are taking place on a weekly basis or even daily basis. This, not to mention house evictions and also home demolitions. And what has happened in Sheikh Jarrah is only a tip of the iceberg, because even as we speak now, they are trying to demolish another neighborhood in Sirwan. And in fact, 22,000 houses has been served eviction notice around or in the vicinity of the old city of Baitul Maqdis, the East Jerusalem. And they have been building walls to separate Palestinian families, to separate them from the water aquifer, so that they cannot water their farms, and children cannot go to school because of the separation wall. So the problem is we need to have a comprehensive program on how to educate the Zionists in Israel, especially the later ones that came as settlers in more recent times. I'm sure we all have watched the video whereby one settler who actually came from New York, he's an American, and he came to Sheikh Jarrah, and he simply took over one house. And the owner of the house asked him, "Why are you stealing my house?" And he simply said that if I don't steal your house, somebody else will. So this is the mentality, hooliganism that we are seeing that came out from such a people. So they need a comprehensive program on how to transform them, to educate them, which I'm sure, like Miko Pellet has said just now, there is no way actually to deal with these people, but to bring them down. We have to bring the Zionists down so that we can start on the journey to resolving the issue, a final status, whereby Palestinians their rights will be restored. They have the right to return, and they will attain full citizenship in a country, whatever you want to name it, based on a democratic, fair democracy. But we must also take into consideration the reminder mentioned by Professor Saul, that even the apartheid system in South Africa, even in the US, whereby the civil rights movement have attained or achieved their objectives, they actually fall short of addressing the issue of injustice. The blacks are still being disenfranchised in terms of the economic pie, in terms of their political empowerment. And so does what happened in South Africa, even though the apartheid system collapsed, but the blacks and the colored people remain as what they were, and even worse in some situation. So there is a danger that we might be able to resolve this issue in the sense that we managed to eliminate the appetite, but yet the the Palestinians will still remain oppressed and their rights still being denied in a so-called where we have restored their rights to their homeland, the rights of return, and so on and so forth. So this is a danger that actually we need to be aware of in our plan, a comprehensive plan to help alleviate the situation of the Palestinians and liberate them in that sense, and empower them so that they will be liberated in the comprehensive sense of the word. Not and what happened in South Africa, or even the experience of the black section of the people of the United States of America be repeated in the case of Palestine. So this is we have a very big task ahead, and it has to be shouldered by the international community, not just the Palestinians, not just the Arab states around Palestine, or not just the Muslim Ummah, not just the civil society. Everyone, including the United Nations, must be together in this comprehensive plan to empower the Palestinians so that they will be given their full rights in the real sense, not being continuously be persecuted or oppressed, just like their counterparts in South Africa. So we need that. We need that cooperation. We need that support of solidarity. So that whatever we plan for the Palestinians will become a reality. So this is a very important session. What have been mentioned by Brother Muslim and Professor Saul and Miko Pellet actually open up our eyes on how we should be moving forward, and the challenge is actually big. It is not something that we can resolve piecemeal, but it has to come in a comprehensive package. Definitely, there's a long way to the final status, and it requires comprehensive framework in order to get this work for the Palestinians in the future. Thank you, Brother Khalid.
Right, thank you, Prof. We are approaching to our end of the programs, but before we end, I would like to welcome back Brother Muslim to say a few words of your hope about these solutions, and what actually, because as you know, that Malaysia is still using and promoting the same framework, two-state solution in the statement and everything. And what's your hope to Malaysia and also to other people in the world, inshallah?
Okay, since we're running out of time, I have listed 5 points that I wanted to highlight, but let me go through them very quickly. And they might seem disconnected, but I leave it to the listeners to connect the dots. Number one, Israel did not prevail because of the might of logic, but because of the logic of might. I am literally translating what we always say in Arabic. Israel did not win Palestine in an academic debate or in an intellectual inquiry. No, they won because of the force that they have. If it's a matter of logic and debates, then maybe Indonesia would now claim parts of Malaysia, Thailand, etc., because the Majapahit Empire or the Srivijaya Empire that existed some few hundred years ago had an existence in a way or another. So Israeli myths and lies and superstitions do not necessarily have to become a reality. This is not our problem. This is their problem. They have to go and verify their myths. Number two, I agree with Saul that South Africa and the US and other examples might not be perfect, and there is still a struggle to take place, especially on the socio-economic level. But I gave these examples, and I believe many give these examples to show that change is possible. Bosnia is another example. The disintegration of the Soviet Union and disintegration of Yugoslavia and many other cases. And in fact, the unification of United Arab Emirates, or even earlier, the unification of the Malay Sultanates, or the unification of Yemen in the 1990s. These are all examples, modern, contemporary examples, to tell us that a political change is possible. It's not impossible, but in order for this to happen in Palestine, either a change on the international political balance of power has to take place, or a serious, real regional realignment has to take place. So far, neither of them have happened in a scale that would impact a real change. So I believe, my second point, that the disintegration of the state of Israel, the end of occupation, the deconstruction of apartheid, the uprooting of illegal settlements or transformation of these settlements into something else, the return of Palestinian refugees, and justice for all is possible. It's still possible. It just requires one of these two important factors, regional or international. The third point is that the most similar system to Israel today is ISIS. I mean, we have to acknowledge reality. You look at the literature of ISIS, the way that this so-called Islamic State of Iraq and Syria was created, expanded, it's no different from Israel. They don't believe in borders. They believe their border should extend as much as their power extends. They don't have a constitution, etc., etc. They're really similar. And for the Israeli settlers, Tel Aviv is no different from Ramallah. Hebron is no different from Tahtekfa. They believe that they have right over Jerusalem, Hebron, Ramallah, Nablus, as much as they have right over Tel Aviv and probably Golan Heights and South Lebanon and probably Sinai. So they have a twisted logic, and this has to be corrected. It can be corrected only by defeating Zionism. This major defeat could actually cause a real paradigm shift. It might require them to rethink their superstitions and myths. Fourth point, the PA, unfortunately, as Sol has rightly highlighted, has become an instrument of clean colonialism. It was created as a transitional political entity that would eventually transform into a Palestinian state. Instead of playing this role, especially in the time of the current Palestinian president, it has become a real instrument to repress the Palestinians and serve Israeli security interests. I mean, to the extent that when Trump decided to cut off the funding of the PA, the Palestinian Authority, it was Netanyahu who objected and told President Trump, no, we need the security forces and security apparatus in the West Bank to protect the state of Israel. This is a very embarrassing and sad reality. Finally, for Malaysia and other international players, you don't have to come up with a solution. It's not your problem. You did not create this occupation. You did not facilitate Israel's existence. Why do you have to come up with a 1-state, 2-state, 3-state, 5-state solution? This is the problem of the superpowers who created Israel. It's the problem of Israel, certainly. What is required from states like Malaysia, Indonesia, Turkey, Japan, China, and others is to articulate the situation on the ground, to address reality, to acknowledge that there is a settler colonial occupation that has transformed into an apartheid. I believe stopping short of proposing a solution would be perfect, would be good enough. If you want to engage in proposing a solution, it has to be a solution that addresses the rights of the conflicting parties, and it has to end occupation and end injustice. But what happens is, to be honest, and I communicate with friends in Maputra and in circles close to Maputra, it has become more of a ritualistic, habit. We have to say something about the two-state solution, because if we don't, and I quote a friend who is very close to, Maputra, if we don't say anything about the two-state solution and we stop short of mentioning a solution, people will think that we have a major policy change. We are advocating something else. That's the answer that I got. But I think stopping short of mentioning the two-state solution helps the Palestinians more than actually, because for Israel, the two-state solution has become an empty PR promise. They look good when we say that Israel really accepts the two-state solution and they want to negotiate. We have been negotiating for 30 years. What has the two-state solution got us? Nowhere. It's time for powers like Malaysia, Indonesia, European countries to actually address apartheid, just like Human Rights Watch has done, just like the leading Israeli human rights group, B'Tselem, has done. Zionism is the problem in the first place. It has to be, I mean, just like the whole world or some in the world united against Nazism, which was, a supremacist extremist ideology, I think they should unite against Zionism, just like they are united now against ISIS ideology. I don't see differences. I mean, this is an interesting PhD proposal or topic. I don't see big differences between ISIS and Israel. Thank you so much for having us in this discussion, and I was very glad to join you, Khalid, and the other panelists.
All right, thank you very much, Muslim, for your points, and thank you, Prof. Saul. Thank you, Dr. Hafizi, for joining us today. Hopefully, we will meet again and continue our discussion on various topics that on Palestine in the future. Hopefully, we can strive together, continue to fight against the occupation, colonialism, and the Zionist regime in Israel. We still has a lot of things to do, and of course, one of that is through supporting BDS efforts, BDS movement. And for those listening from Malaysia, hopefully you can contribute to our cause in BDS Malaysia, and we have a lot of activities we arrange throughout the year, and hopefully we can come together and work hard to support our Palestinian brothers and sisters, inshallah. For that, thank you again to all speakers, and hopefully we'll meet again in the future. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Bye-bye.
Salam.